The island of Kethara had been home to the same 300 souls for as long as anyone could remember, surrounded by endless ocean and protected by the sacred forest that no one dared enter. The villagers lived in perfect isolation, exactly as the elders commanded. Then Mira saw the boar. It stepped from the tree line at dawn, massive and scarred, with eyes that held impossible intelligence. But boars didn't exist on Kethara. Nothing lived in the forest. The elders had sworn this truth for generations. What Mira didn't tell the panicking villagers was that she recognized those scars. She'd seen them before, in the forbidden books her grandmother had hidden, books that spoke of other lands, other islands, and the ancient magic that kept them separated. As the village's secret keeper of lost knowledge, Mira knew this boar's arrival meant their protective barriers were failing. The ocean around them was no longer empty. Something was coming across the water, something that would expose the lies their entire civilization was built upon. But why had the boar come as a warning, and what was hunting it? Mira pressed herself against the rough bark of the watchtower, her heart hammering against her ribs as the creature's gaze swept across the village square below. The boar's tusks gleamed white in the morning light, curved like crescent moons, and etched with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The marked ones carry messages between worlds, child. Pray you never see one, for it means the veils grow thin." The warning bell began its frantic tolling as other villagers spotted the impossible intruder. Shutters slammed closed throughout the settlement, and Mira could hear the urgent whispers of mothers calling their children inside. Elder Thorne's voice boomed across the square, commanding everyone to remain calm, but even from her perch, Mira could see the tremor in his weathered hands. "Impossible," Thorne muttered, his ceremonial staff clicking against the cobblestones as he approached the beast. "The forest protects us. Nothing enters, nothing leaves. The ancient pact—" The boar snorted, a sound that carried an almost mocking intelligence, and stepped closer to the village fountain. Where its hooves touched the stones, Mira noticed something that made her stomach clench with dread. The carefully maintained illusion work that kept the cobblestones looking uniform flickered, revealing glimpses of far older stonework beneath, symbols and patterns that matched those in her grandmother's hidden books. From her hiding place, Mira fumbled for the small leather satchel she always carried, pulling out a worn journal bound in scales that caught the light strangely. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands on her deathbed 3 years ago, along with a warning that had seemed like fevered ramblings at the time. "When the marked ones return, the island will remember what it truly is. The elders know more than they speak, and our safety depends on their silence." The boar's head turned suddenly, those ancient eyes fixing on her tower window with unsettling precision. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Mira felt as though the creature was looking not at her, but through her, seeing something that lay hidden in her very bones. Then it did something that nearly sent her tumbling from her perch. It nodded, a distinctly human gesture of acknowledgement. Below, Elder Thorne had gathered the other council members, their ceremonial robes rustling as they formed a protective circle around the fountain. Mira could see their lips moving in the ancient words of binding, the same incantations they performed during the monthly ceremonies to strengthen the forest's protection. But the boar remained unmoved, and if anything, seemed to grow more solid, more present, as though their magic was having the opposite effect. "The barriers weaken," whispered a voice so close to Mira's ear that she spun around, nearly losing her grip on the journal. But the small chamber was empty, holding only dust motes dancing in the morning light. Her grandmother's voice, she realized with a chill. Somehow, the boar's presence was awakening more than just hidden truths about the island. A new sound reached her ears, a rhythmic splashing from the harbor that had never been there before. Mira scrambled to the tower's eastern window, her pulse racing as she peered out at waters that had been empty just hours ago. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, too large and too purposeful to be fish. Whatever the boar had been fleeing was already here, circling their island like predators testing the strength of a cage. The journal in her hands began to warm, its scaled cover pulse with a faint blue-green light that matched the glow now emanating from the boar's tusks. As if responding to some unheard signal, pages began flipping of their own accord, settling on a passage written in her grandmother's careful script. When the ocean remembers its children and the forest can no longer hold back the truth, the island will choose, remain hidden in lies, or embrace the dangerous freedom of what we truly are. The boar lifted its massive head and released a sound unlike anything Mira had ever heard, part roar, part song, part warning cry that seemed to resonate from the very foundations of the island itself. The boar's body lay motionless in the village square as dawn broke over Kethara, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe around the creature's massive form. Ilara knelt beside it, her weathered hands hovering just above the coarse black hide, afraid to make contact. In 43 years of life on the island, she had never seen anything emerge from the whispering wood. "It's not natural," murmured Thomas, the village blacksmith, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "Nothing that size should exist here. Nothing does exist here." Ilara forced herself to touch the boar's flank. The flesh was cold, but not with the chill of death. Rather, it felt like stone that had never known warmth. Her fingers recoiled as if burned. "Thomas, look at this!" She pointed to symbols carved deep into the animal's hide, etched so precisely they appeared intentional rather than battle scars. The markings were unlike anything in their written language, yet something about them tugged at the edges of her memory. Spirals within spirals, intersected by lines that seemed to pulse even in death. Thomas knelt beside her, squinting at the strange script. "I've seen these before," he whispered, his face draining of color. "In my grandfather's journal. He called them the old marks. That's impossible. Your grandfather was a smith, not a scholar." He was more than that. Thomas's hands trembled as he traced the air above the symbols, careful not to touch them. "The journal's hidden in my forge. He wrote about the time before the protection, before the village was safe." Ilara's blood chilled. The protection was sacred law, the ancient barrier that kept Kethara isolated from the outside world, ensuring their peace and security. According to village law, it had always existed, woven into the very fabric of their island home. "Before the protection?" she repeated. "Thomas, that doesn't make sense, doesn't it?" His eyes met hers, and she saw her own growing dread reflected there. When was the last time anyone tried to sail beyond the mist? When did anyone even want to? The question struck her like a physical blow. She realized with horror that she couldn't remember ever feeling curious about the world beyond their shores. The thought of leaving Kethara had simply never occurred to her, or to anyone. Around them, other villagers had begun to gather, drawn by some invisible compulsion to witness the impossible creature. Maya Thorne, the baker's daughter, pointed at the boar's tusks with a shaking finger. "They're not bone," she said. "They're metal. Look how they catch the light." Indeed, the massive tusks gleamed with an otherworldly sheen, reflecting not the morning sun, but something else entirely, images that flickered too quickly to identify. Ilara leaned closer and gasped. In the polished surface she glimpsed herself, but not as she was now. The reflection showed her younger, wearing clothes she'd never owned, standing in a place she'd never seen, a vast city of towers that pierced the clouds. "Everyone sees something different," Thomas said quietly. "I've been watching. Maya sees herself flying. Old Henrik sees himself in a field of flowers that stretch beyond the horizon. Things that can't exist here. Memories," Ilara breathed, the word escaping before she could stop it. "They're showing us memories." But that was impossible too. She had lived her entire life on Kethara, had been born here, raised here. Her parents had told her stories of her childhood in the little house by the harbor. She remembered. The memories crumbled as she tried to examine them closely, like sand slipping through her fingers. When she attempted to recall her 5th birthday, the details blurred and shifted. When she thought of learning to read, the image of her teacher's face dissolved into uncertainty. A new voice cut through her mounting panic. It's starting. They turned to see Sage Aldrich approaching, his ancient frame moving with surprising urgency. The village's oldest resident rarely left his cottage, yet here he stood, staring at the dead boar with eyes that held terrible knowledge. "What's starting?" Ilara demanded, rising to face him. "The unmaking," he replied, his voice hollow. "The boar is just the first. The protection is failing, and with it, the barriers that have kept our minds quiet. You know what this means," Thomas accused. "You've known all along." Aldrich nodded slowly. "I'm the keeper. It was my burden to remember so that when this day came, I could guide you through what follows. But I had hoped—" His voice broke. "I had hoped it would never come." The morning air grew thick with tension as the villagers processed his words. Ilara felt reality shifting beneath her feet like sand in a tide. "Who are we really?" she whispered. Aldrich's ancient eyes met hers, filled with sorrow and something that might have been relief. "That, my dear, is what we're about to discover." The village council chamber felt smaller than usual as Elena sat across from the 5 elders, their weathered faces illuminated by flickering oil lamps. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the wooden shutters with an urgency that matched her heartbeat. "Tell us again about the boar," Elder Matthias said, his fingers steepled before him. His voice carried the weight of authority that had guided Kethara for 3 decades. Elena recounted the morning's events, choosing her words carefully. She described the creature's size, its strange behavior, the way it had simply vanished into the forest. But she held back the most unsettling detail, how the boar's eyes had seemed almost human in their intelligence, as if it recognized her. Elder Sophia leaned forward, her silver hair catching the lamplight. "And you're certain it came from the thornwood?" "Yes. It emerged from the path that leads to the old ruins." A heavy silence settled over the chamber. The elders exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge Elena wasn't privy to. Finally, Elder Matthias cleared his throat. "Elena, what do you know of your family's history on this island?" The question caught her off guard. "My grandmother's family has been here for generations. She used to tell stories about the old days, before the thornwood became forbidden." "And what did she tell you about why it was forbidden?" Elena frowned, searching her memory. "She said there were dangerous animals in there, wild things that could hurt people. But even as she spoke the words, they felt incomplete, like half-remembered fragments of a larger truth." Elder Matthias stood and walked to an ancient wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to your great-grandfather, Thomas Crane. He was the island's record-keeper before the laws changed." Elena's breath caught. Her grandmother had rarely spoken of Thomas, and when she did, it was always with a sadness that seemed to run deeper than simple loss. "He wrote extensively about the island's unique properties," Elder Sophia continued, "things we've kept hidden for good reason." Matthias opened the journal and read aloud, "The boundary grows weaker with each passing year. I fear what may happen when it fails entirely. The creatures of the deep forest are not mere animals, but something far more ancient. They are guardians of truths our kind was never meant to know." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What kind of truths?" "That's what we're trying to understand," Elder Sophia said. "Your great-grandfather believed that Kethara exists in a delicate balance, that the thornwood serves as more than just a forest, a barrier." Elder Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "Between our world and something else." Elena's mind reeled. "That's impossible. You're talking about magic." Elder Sophia's smile was sad. "Your generation has been raised to believe such things are mere superstition. We thought it was kinder that way, safer. But the boar's appearance changes things," Matthias said, closing the journal. "If the barriers are weakening, if creatures from the deep forest are beginning to cross over—" "Then what?" Elena demanded. "What exactly are you afraid of?" The elders fell silent again. It was Marcus who finally answered, his words heavy with resignation. "Your great-grandfather's final entry speaks of a prophecy. a warning passed down from the island's first inhabitants. He paused, as if weighing whether to continue. It says that when the guardians of the forest begin to emerge, it signals the return of the forgotten ones, beings who once walked between worlds before they were banished beyond the veil. Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. This is madness. You're talking about fairy tales and legends, are we? Elder Sophia asked quietly. Then how do you explain what you saw today? How do you explain the dreams, Elena? The question hit her like a physical blow. Elena had never mentioned the dreams to anyone, the recurring visions of shadowy figures moving through mist-shrouded forests, of voices calling her name in languages she didn't recognize. How did you— Because you're Thomas Crane's great-granddaughter, Matthias said gently, and his bloodline has always been sensitive to the island's deeper currents. Elena sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. What do you want from me? We need you to go back to the Thornwood, Elder Sophia said, to follow the path the boar took and see what lies beyond. That's suicide. Perhaps, but you may be the only one who can cross the boundary safely. Your great-grandfather believed that his descendants would play a crucial role when the time came. Elena looked around the chamber at the 5 faces watching her expectantly. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the shutters, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell her something, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. And, if I refuse, Elder Matthias's expression grew grave. Then we may all discover just how fragile our protected world truly is. The morning mist clung to the forest edge like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the ancient trees. Maya pressed her back against the rough bark of an oak, her heart hammering as she peered through the undergrowth. The boar's tracks had led her here, to the very boundary she'd been warned never to cross. Behind her, the familiar sounds of the village awakening drifted on the salt-tinged breeze, the creak of shutters opening, the distant lowing of cattle, children's voices calling to one another. Ahead lay only silence, thick and unnatural, as if the forest itself held its breath. The tracks were fresh, carved deep into the soft earth where yesterday's rain had left the ground yielding. But these weren't ordinary hoofprints. Maya knelt, running her fingers along the edge of one impression. The mark was too large, too angular, and there was something else, a faint luminescence that seemed to pulse beneath her touch like a heartbeat. You shouldn't be here. Maya spun, her hand flying to the hunting knife at her belt. An elderly woman emerged from between the trees, moving with surprising grace despite her weathered appearance. Her hair was white as sea foam, braided with what looked like strips of bark and small bones. Maya had never seen her before, yet something about the woman's pale eyes seemed achingly familiar. I'm tracking the boar, Maya said, forcing her voice steady. It attacked our livestock. The woman's laugh was like wind through dry leaves. Attacked? Child, that creature was running for its life, just as you should be. She stepped closer, and Maya caught the scent of wild herbs and something deeper, older, like stone, that had never seen sunlight. Running from what? From what's stirring in the deep places, from what your people's presence here has finally awakened. The woman's gaze fixed on the glowing tracks. How long did you think you could live on borrowed time? How long did you believe the barriers would hold? Maya's mouth went dry. What barriers? What are you talking about? Before the woman could answer, the ground beneath their feet trembled. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but then the tremor grew stronger. The trees swayed without wind, their leaves rustling in agitation. From somewhere deep in the forest came a sound, low, resonant, like the groan of the earth itself. It begins, the woman whispered. The convergence your ancestors feared. The air shimmered, and for a moment Maya saw something impossible. The forest wavered like a reflection in disturbed water, and through it she glimpsed another landscape entirely. Twisted spires of black rock reaching toward a crimson sky, creatures with too many limbs skittering between formations that hurt to look at directly. Then the vision snapped back to normal forest, leaving Maya gasping and disoriented. What was that? She breathed. Reality, thinning. The island exists in a delicate balance, child. Your village, this forest, the very ground you stand on, it's all suspended between worlds, and that balance is failing. Maya stumbled backward, her mind reeling. That's impossible. This is just an island. We've lived here for generations. Generations built on a lie. The woman's voice was gentle but implacable. Your ancestors didn't settle here by chance. They were refugees, fleeing something so terrible they were willing to hide between dimensions rather than face it. They bound this place with rituals and sacrifice, creating a pocket of safety in the spaces between realities. Another tremor shook the ground, stronger this time. In the distance, Maya heard shouts from the village, confused, frightened voices calling out in alarm. "The bindings are weakening," the woman continued. "Your people have forgotten the old ways, stopped performing the necessary rites. And now the barriers that have protected you for so long are dissolving." Maya's thoughts raced to her grandmother's stories, the ones everyone dismissed as folklore, tales of strange lights in the forest, of villagers who vanished without trace, of ceremonies performed at the stone circle that older generations claimed were vital but could never explain why. "The stone circle," she said suddenly. "My grandmother always said it was important, that we had to maintain it." The woman nodded grimly. "The anchor point. But when did your people last gather there? When did they last renew the protective ward?" Maya couldn't remember. The circle had become just another landmark, a curiosity from the past that the village council occasionally talked about, preserving for its historical value. A new sound joined the earth's groaning, the crack and splinter of wood. Through the trees, Maya saw something that made her blood freeze. A massive tree, one that had stood for centuries, was splitting down its center. But instead of revealing heartwood, the split showed only darkness, a void that seemed to pull at the light around it. "You have perhaps days," the woman said, backing away into the forest shadows. "Find the old knowledge, relearn the rituals, or watch your world, all our worlds, tear apart at the seams." "Wait!" Maya called, but the woman had already vanished, leaving only the scent of herbs and the echo of her warning. The tremors were growing stronger, and Maya could hear panic spreading through the village below. The morning mist clung to the village like a shroud. As Kira made her way through the narrow streets, the boar's tusks wrapped carefully in oiled cloth beneath her arm. Sleep had been impossible after witnessing the creature's impossible healing, and now, with dawn breaking over the thatched roofs, she felt compelled to seek answers from the one person who might have them. Elder Thorne's cottage sat at the village's eastern edge, where the cobblestones gave way to packed earth and wild grass. Smoke curled from his chimney, a promising sign that he was awake. Kira had known the old man since childhood. He'd taught her to read the old scripts, to identify herbs by their leaves alone, and to listen to the stories the wind carried from the forest. If anyone understood what she'd witnessed, it would be him. She knocked softly, 3 gentle raps that had become their signal over the years. "Enter, child." His voice carried through the heavy wooden door, raspy but warm. The cottage's interior was exactly as Kira remembered. Shelves lined with glass jars containing dried plants, unusual stones, and what appeared to be fragments of bone. Books bound in cracked leather leaned against each other in precarious stacks, and the air smelled of sage and something else, something metallic and strange. Thorne sat at his small table, bent over a cup of steaming tea. His white hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his pale blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "You brought something," he said. It wasn't a question. Kira unwrapped the tusks and placed them on the table. The bone gleamed in the firelight, and she noticed something she'd missed before. Thin lines of silver seemed to run through the ivory like veins. Thorne's face went ashen. He reached out with trembling fingers, hovering just above the tusks without touching them. "Where did you find these?" "The boar that attacked yesterday. I helped Magnus remove them, but—" She hesitated, unsure how to explain what she'd seen. "But they regenerated." Thorne's voice was barely a whisper. The creature healed itself before your eyes." Kira stared at him. "How did you know?" The old man stood abruptly, moving to one of his bookshelves. He pulled down a leather-bound volume so old that pieces of the binding flaked away at his touch. "Because this isn't the first time, child, and I fear it won't be the last." He opened the book carefully, revealing pages covered in faded ink and strange diagrams. Kira could make out sketches of animals, boars, yes, but also wolves with too many eyes, birds with wingspans that seemed impossible, and creatures she couldn't identify at all. "Your great-grandmother was the last to witness such things," Thorn continued, turning the yellowed pages. "She was about your age when the barrier began to weaken the first time." "What barrier?" Thorn looked at her with an expression caught between pity and fear. "The one that keeps us safe, the one that keeps us hidden, the one that's beginning to fail." Before Kira could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts echoed through the morning air, followed by the sound of running feet. Through the cottage's small window, she could see villagers hurrying toward the harbor. "Another one!" someone yelled. "Another beast from the forest!" Thorn slammed the book shut and grabbed a walking stick from beside the door. Despite his age, he moved with surprising speed as he followed Kira outside. The crowd had gathered at the harbor's edge, pointing toward the water. At first, Kira saw nothing unusual, just the familiar sight of fishing boats bobbing at anchor and the endless expanse of grey ocean beyond. Then something breached the surface. It was massive, easily twice the size of their largest boat. Scales the color of deep emeralds caught the morning light as the creature's serpentine neck rose from the waves. Its head was triangular, reptilian, with eyes that glowed like amber lanterns. When it opened its mouth, rows of crystalline teeth gleamed like shattered glass. The sea monster let out a sound unlike anything Kira had ever heard. Part roar, part song, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The very air seemed to vibrate with its call, and she felt something respond deep in her chest, as if her own heart was trying to answer. "Impossible," Magnus breathed, appearing at her side. "Sea serpents are just stories, legends." "So were forest boars with regenerating tusks," Kira replied, her eyes fixed on the magnificent creature. The serpent's gaze swept across the gathered villagers, and when those burning amber eyes met hers, Kira felt a jolt of recognition. Not personal recognition, she'd never seen this creature before, but something deeper, something that spoke to a part of her she hadn't known existed. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the serpent submerged, leaving only ripples to mark its presence. "It's beginning," Thorn whispered beside her, his knuckles white as he gripped his walking stick. "The old world is bleeding through." The ancient oak's hollow seemed to breathe around them as Maya pressed her palm against the smooth inner wall. The wood felt warm, almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Finn crouched beside her, his lantern casting dancing shadows that made the carved symbols appear to writhe and shift. "Look at this," Maya whispered, tracing a spiral pattern with her fingertip. "It's not just carved into the wood. It's growing from within it." The symbol glowed faintly at her touch, and suddenly the cramped space filled with a soft golden light that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. Other symbols began to illuminate in sequence, creating a constellation of meaning neither of them could decipher. Finn reached for his journal, but his hand froze as a voice echoed from somewhere deep within the tree, or perhaps from somewhere much farther away. The barriers weaken, the old contracts strain against their bonds. Maya jerked her hand back, but the voice continued, "Neither male nor female, neither young nor old." It carried the weight of centuries and the whisper of wind through leaves. "Who seeks the truth of the threshold?" "We do," Maya said, surprised by her own boldness. Finn shot her a warning look, but she pressed forward. "We need to understand what's happening to our island. The boar, the forest, everything's changing." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Then the light pulsed brighter, and images began to form within the hollow's walls, not carved or painted, but somehow projected from the wood itself. They saw their island as it had never been in their lifetime, larger, wilder, connected to vast continents by bridges of land that stretched beyond the horizon. Strange creatures roamed freely, not just boars, but wolves with silver eyes, great cats with coats that shimmered like starlight, and beings that walked upright but were clearly not human. "Long ago," the voice resumed, "your island was part of a greater world, where magic flowed as freely as water, but the people grew afraid of what they could not control. They sought safety in separation." The images shifted, showing robed figures standing in circles around massive stones, chanting words that made the air itself ripple. The land began to fragment, pieces breaking away like ice floes, drifting into an ocean of mist and possibility. "The severance," Finn breathed, recognizing the legend from the oldest village stories. "It really happened. Your ancestors chose isolation over integration, safety over truth. They bound the island in protective wards, sealed it away from the chaos of the changing world. But every binding has a cost." Maya watched, transfixed, as the images showed their island shrinking, the magical creatures fading like morning mist. The villagers who remained grew smaller in more than just number. Their children were born with less of the old knowledge, less connection to the forces that had once shaped their world. "For 300 years, the barriers have held. Your people have been safe, but they have also been cut off from the greater tapestry of existence. Now the magical energies that maintain the severance grow weak. The barriers crack. What was separated begins to reunite." The boar appeared in the swirling images, but not as the terrifying creature that had emerged from the forest. Instead, they saw it in its original form, a guardian beast, noble and wise, charged with maintaining the balance between worlds. The guardian awakens because it must. The severance cannot hold much longer. Your island will rejoin the greater world whether you will it or not. The question is whether your people will be ready for what comes next. "What do you mean, ready?" Maya asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "The world beyond has not stood still during your isolation. Magic has evolved, twisted into new forms. There are those who would claim your island for its unique properties, land that has been sealed away from time and change. There are also those who would see it destroyed, rather than allow its secrets to fall into the wrong hands." Finn's journal fell from his trembling fingers. "How long do we have?" "The next full moon will see the barriers fail completely. Until then, they will continue to weaken. More guardians will emerge from the deep forest. More cracks will appear in the foundations of your world." The images began to fade, but not before they caught a glimpse of something that made both teenagers' blood run cold. Ships on the horizon, bearing flags they didn't recognize, filled with figures whose intentions remained ominously unclear. "Choose wisely," the voice whispered as the golden light dimmed. "Will you cling to the illusion of safety your ancestors created, or will you prepare your people for the reality that approaches?" The hollow fell dark and silent, leaving Maya and Finn alone with the weight of impossible knowledge. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of something large moving through the forest, and the distant crash of waves against shores that might not remain theirs for much longer. The ancient oak's hollow stretched deeper than Kira had imagined, its interior walls smooth as polished bone and marked with symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering torchlight. Elder Thorn moved ahead with surprising agility for his age, his weathered fingers tracing patterns along the curved surface as they descended into the earth's embrace. "How long has this been here?" Kira whispered, though the acoustics of the tunnel made her voice carry strangely, echoing back with an odd resonance that didn't quite sound like her own. "Since before the village, since before memory itself." Thorn's reply came from somewhere ahead in the darkness. "The first settlers found it, just as we have. They thought themselves fortunate to discover such shelter, such protection. They had no idea what they were truly finding." The tunnel began to level out, and Kira could smell something different in the air. Not the earthy dampness of underground spaces, but something metallic and sharp, like the taste of lightning. The walls here were no longer wood, but some kind of smooth stone that gave off its own faint luminescence, pale blue-green like moonlight on water. "Thorn," she called softly, quickening her pace. "What did you mean when you said the island chooses who can leave? People have left before, traders, young people seeking adventure in the mainland cities. I've seen them go." The old man stopped so abruptly that she nearly collided with him. When he turned, his eyes held a sadness so profound it made her chest tighten. "Have you, child? Have you truly seen them leave? Or did you see them walk to the harbor, wave goodbye, and simply accept that they were gone?" The question struck her like a physical blow. Kira's mind raced backward through her memories, searching for faces, for names. Marcus, who had left 3 summers ago to study at the university. Elena, who had departed to marry a merchant's son in Port Kellum. Had she actually seen their boats disappear over the horizon? Had anyone ever received letters from the outside world? "The island maintains the illusion beautifully," Thorn continued, his voice gentle but inexorable. "It must, you see. The barrier that protects us from what lies beyond is not merely physical. It's woven into the very fabric of perception itself. We see what we need to see to remain content, to stay safe, to never question too deeply." They had reached a vast circular chamber, its domed ceiling lost in shadows above. The bioluminescent walls pulsed gently, like a great heart beating in the darkness. In the center of the space stood something that made Kira's breath catch. A pillar of the same smooth material, but this one was covered in moving symbols, flowing and shifting like liquid light across its surface. "The control nexus," Thorn said simply, "the heart of our prison, our protection, depending on how you choose to see it." Kira approached the pillar slowly, drawn by forces she couldn't name. The symbols seemed to respond to her presence, their movement becoming more rapid, more urgent. "What is this place? What are these markings?" Instructions, warnings, a record of what came before. Thorn's hand settled on her shoulder. "Your people, Kira, your true people. The ones who built this sanctuary when the world above became too dangerous to survive in." "My people?" She turned to face him, confusion and growing fear warring in her chest. "Thorn, what are you talking about? I was born here just like my parents, like everyone." "Were you?" His eyes were infinitely sad. "Tell me, child, do you remember your mother's pregnancy, your birth, the early years of your childhood?" The questions hit her like hammers. Kira opened her mouth to answer, to recite the familiar stories she'd always known about her early life, but found the words dissolving on her tongue. The memories were there, weren't they? Soft and warm and comforting, like favorite songs heard from another room. But when she reached for them directly, tried to grasp them with the precision of adult awareness, they seemed to slip away like mist. "The island provides what we need," Thorn said quietly. "Memories, histories, a sense of continuity and belonging. But the truth, Kira, is that none of us aged beyond our prime until we were meant to. None of us truly remember childhoods because we never had them. Not here, not in these forms." The pillar's light was growing brighter, the symbols moving so quickly now they blurred into streams of liquid fire. Kira could feel something awakening in her mind, like doors long sealed beginning to crack open. "What are we?" she whispered. "Refugees," Thorn replied. "Survivors of a war that raged above while we slept below. And now, after all these centuries, something has changed. The barriers are weakening. The wild boar was just the beginning, a scout from the world we fled." The symbols suddenly stopped moving, freezing in a pattern that burned itself into Kira's vision. In that moment she understood with crystalline clarity that everything she had believed about her life, her world, her very existence, had been a beautiful, necessary lie. And now the truth was finally beginning to wake up. The ancient tome felt warm beneath Kira's fingertips, its leather binding seeming to pulse with a life of its own. She had found it hidden behind a loose stone in the lighthouse's foundation, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow kept it pristine despite decades of salt air and moisture. The others gathered around her in the lamp room as she carefully opened it, the brass hinges creaking in protest. "Can you read it?" Marcus asked, peering over her shoulder at the strange symbols covering the yellowed pages. Kira frowned, running her finger along the lines of text. The script was unlike anything she had seen before, yet somehow familiar. As she stared, the symbols seemed to shift and reorganize themselves, becoming clearer with each passing moment. It's changing, like it wants to be understood. Elena stepped closer, her weathered face grave. That's the old tongue. I haven't seen it written in 40 years, but my grandmother taught me fragments when I was young. She pointed to a passage near the top of the page. This word here, it means guardian, or keeper. The lighthouse beams swept across the harbor below them, its light catching the foam of waves that had grown increasingly violent since the Boar's appearance. Thomas pressed against the window, watching the churning water with growing unease. The sea's getting worse. Look at those swells, they're moving wrong, like something massive is disturbing them from below. Kira turned the page, and a detailed map unfolded before them. The island was there, but it looked different, larger, with sections that didn't match their current geography. Strange symbols marked various locations, and lines of power seemed to connect them in an intricate pattern. A ley line network, Finn breathed, recognizing the pattern from his studies of ancient civilizations. The entire island is built on intersecting energy lines. But look here. He pointed to a section of the map that showed their familiar coastline. We're not on the main island, we're on a fragment, separated from the rest. Elena's face had gone pale as she studied the map more closely. The stories my grandmother told. I always thought they were just tales to frighten children, but this... She traced a finger along what appeared to be a massive barrier surrounding their section of the island. She spoke of the sundering, when the island was split to contain something terrible. The Boar wasn't supposed to be able to cross over. Marcus grabbed the lantern and held it closer to the page. What does this symbol mean? He indicated a complex glyph positioned at the center of their fragment, directly where the village stood. Kira felt the words forming in her mind as she looked at the symbol, as if the knowledge was being downloaded directly into her consciousness. Anchor point. We're the anchor. The village, everyone in it. We're what's keeping the barrier stable. A distant roar echoed across the water, deep and resonant, carrying a note of ancient fury that made their bones vibrate. It was answered by another roar from the opposite direction, then another, until the night air thrummed with the calls of creatures that had no business existing in their world. They're waking up, Elena whispered. All of them. The Boar was just the first. Thomas spun away from the window, his face etched with fear. There's something moving in the water, multiple somethings. They're huge. Kira flipped through more pages, the ancient knowledge flowing into her with increasing intensity. Images of massive creatures filled the parchment, beings of shadow and scale, of horn and claw, things that belonged to the world before humans had ever set foot on the island. Each creature was bound to a specific location, held in check by the same barrier that separated their small fragment from the greater whole. The barrier is failing, she said, the words tumbling out as the revelation hit her. It was never meant to be permanent. It was a stopgap, a way to buy time while a permanent solution was found. But generations passed, and the knowledge was lost. Now the anchor points are weakening. Elena sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. My grandmother was the last keeper. She died before she could pass on the full ritual. I only know fragments, pieces of the old ways. The lighthouse beam flickered, and for a moment the shadows in the room seemed to deepen and move independently of the light. When the beam steadied, they could all see it, a faint crack running down one wall of the lamp room, as if the structure itself was beginning to fail. How long do we have? Marcus asked. Kira turned to the final pages of the tome, where calculations and astronomical charts covered the parchment in intricate detail. The answer was there, written in the alignment of stars and the movement of celestial bodies that influenced the island's ancient magic. 3 days, she whispered. When the new moon reaches its apex, the barrier will collapse completely. Everything that was separated will become one again. The lighthouse beam swept across waters now churning with the movement of creatures that had been sleeping for centuries, and the night filled with the sound of an ancient world awakening. The ancient tree's hollow welcomed them into darkness that seemed to breathe. Elena felt the bark close behind them like a living door, sealing off the chaos of the pursuing shadows. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed deeper into the cramped space, following Marcus's silhouette ahead of her. "Keep moving," he whispered, his voice oddly distorted in the confined space. "This passage runs beneath the island's heart." The wood around them pulsed with a rhythm that matched no earthly heartbeat. Elena's fingers traced the smooth walls, feeling warmth that had nothing to do with body heat. Phosphorescent veins threaded through the living timber, casting an eerie blue-green glow that illuminated their descent. "Marcus," she breathed. "What is this place really?" He paused, turning back to face her in the ghostly light. Lines of exhaustion etched his features, but his eyes held a fierce determination. "The truth you've been seeking. The truth about what lies beneath Mistral Island." The passage widened into a vast underground chamber carved from living rock and root. Enormous trees grew inverted from the ceiling, their canopies spreading downward like umbrellas of silver leaves. The air hummed with energy that made Elena's skin tingle. "My God," she whispered. Ancient symbols covered every surface, not carved, but grown into the very substance of the chamber. They writhed and shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them, settling into stillness the moment her gaze fixed upon them. "The villagers don't know about this," Marcus said, leading her across a bridge of woven roots. "Most of them, anyway. The council has guarded this secret for generations." "What secret?" Elena's voice echoed strangely, multiplying into harmonies that shouldn't exist. Marcus stopped before a pool of water that reflected no light, its surface black as polished obsidian. "That our island isn't just isolated by ocean. It exists in a fold between worlds, a pocket where reality wears thin." The water began to glow from within, revealing depths that defied physics. Images swirled in its darkness. Cities of impossible architecture, beings of light and shadow, skies painted with colors that had no names. "The barriers are failing," Marcus continued, his reflection fracturing into multiple versions of himself in the pool's surface. "They've been weakening for decades. The Boar wasn't an invasion. It was a warning, a herald of what's coming through." Elena knelt beside the pool, mesmerized by the visions flowing through its depths. She saw the village as it truly was, not quaint cottages and fishing boats, but a complex web of protective enchantments woven from will and belief. Every tradition, every ritual the villagers performed, added another thread to the barrier holding back the chaos beyond. "The storms," she realized, "they're not natural weather patterns. Pressure waves," Marcus confirmed, reality trying to reassert itself, but each wave grows stronger. A new image formed in the pool, Thomas Blackwood standing in his study, but not alone. Shadowy figures surrounded him, their forms shifting between human and something else entirely. His eyes glowed with the same phosphorescent light that threaded through the chamber walls. "He knows," Elena said. "Thomas knows what's happening. More than knows. He's been preparing for it. The question is whether he plans to strengthen the barriers or shatter them completely." The pool's surface erupted in a geyser of silver light. When it settled, Elena saw her own face staring back, but older, marked with symbols that moved beneath her skin like living tattoos. Her eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed both wonderful and terrible. "What am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus's hand found her shoulder, warm and reassuring. "Someone with the power to tip the balance. Your sensitivity to the island's strangeness isn't coincidence, Elena. You're attuned to the frequency of the barriers themselves. You can feel them because part of you exists on both sides of the veil." The chamber shuddered around them. Dust rained from the ceiling as something massive moved above, or perhaps below. The distinction seemed meaningless in this place where directions bent back on themselves. "They've found us," Marcus said, urgency sharpening his voice. "We need to reach the council chamber before—" His words were cut off by a sound that bypassed the ears entirely, resonating directly in their bones. The phosphorescent veins in the walls flared brilliant white, then began to dim one by one, darkness creeping across the chamber like a living thing. Elena felt the change in her marrow, reality shifting, bending, preparing to snap. The careful balance that had protected the island for centuries was finally giving way. Whatever was coming through the cracks between worlds would reshape everything in its wake. She looked once more into the pool and saw not visions of other realms, but her own village burning with cold fire, while its inhabitants transformed into something altogether different. The peaceful isolation of Mistral Island was ending, whether they were ready or not. The hunt for truth had become a race for survival. The ancient chamber stretched before them like a cathedral of bone and shadow, its walls carved from living rock that pulsed with veins of ethereal blue light. Kira's torch flickered weakly against the vastness, illuminating only fragments of the impossible architecture that surrounded them. Spiraling columns twisted upward into darkness, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. "This can't be real," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "We're still on the island, aren't we?" Elder Thorn moved past them with surprising agility, his weathered hands trailing along the glowing veins in the stone. "Reality is more fragile than you imagine, boy. What you call real is merely the surface of something far deeper." The Boar had led them here through passages that defied geometry, corridors that bent back upon themselves and stairs that descended while somehow climbing upward. Now it stood at the chamber's center, beside a raised dais of black stone, its intelligent eyes reflecting the blue radiance like captured starlight. Kira approached the dais cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. Upon its surface lay an orb of crystalline material, roughly the size of her head, within which swirled patterns of light and shadow that resembled distant galaxies. As she drew closer, the patterns began to coalesce into recognizable shapes, islands floating in an endless void, connected by streams of luminous energy. "The Nexus," Thorn said, his voice heavy with reverence and fear. "The heart of the barrier that has protected our world for 3 centuries. Protected us from what?" Kira reached toward the orb, then hesitated as the patterns within began to accelerate, spinning faster and faster until they blurred into a maelstrom of light. From the convergence, Thorn's expression was grim. From the moment when all possible realities collapse into one and the barriers between worlds dissolve forever. Marcus stepped forward, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. "You're talking about parallel dimensions, multiple realities existing simultaneously." "Not just existing," Thorn corrected, "overlapping, bleeding into each other. Our island isn't just a place, Marcus. It's a sanctuary, a pocket of stability in an ocean of chaos where fragments of different worlds have been gathered and preserved." The Boar snorted softly, and Kira felt a strange tingling in her mind, as if the creature were trying to communicate directly with her thoughts. Images flashed unbidden through her consciousness, vast machines of impossible complexity, beings of pure energy, tending to networks of light that spanned the cosmos, and at the center of it all, a creeping darkness that devoured everything in its path. "The Void Plague," she gasped, the words emerging from some deep well of inherited knowledge. "It's spreading across the multiverse, consuming entire realities." Thorn nodded gravely. "The original inhabitants of this nexus, the architects, built these sanctuaries as arks, gathering survivors from worlds already lost. Our ancestors were refugees, Kira, pulled from a dozen different Earths as their realities crumbled." The chamber shuddered suddenly, and hairline cracks appeared in the crystalline orb. The blue veins in the walls flickered like a dying heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of stone grinding against stone. "The barrier is failing," Marcus said, his face pale in the wavering light. "That's why the Boar came through. It's not an invasion, it's a warning. The architects programmed their guardians well, Thorn agreed, gesturing toward the Boar. When the barriers weaken, they emerge to guide the chosen ones to the nexus. But maintaining the sanctuary requires a conscious will, someone willing to bond with the crystalline core and become its living anchor. Kira felt the weight of destiny settling around her like a burial shroud. That's why you brought us here, not to witness, but to choose. The choice was always yours to make, Thorn replied. I'm too old, too set in my ways. The nexus requires someone young, someone adaptable enough to grow with it over the centuries ahead. Another tremor shook the chamber, more violent than the first. Chunks of stone rained from the ceiling, and the cracks in the orb spread like a spider's web across its surface. Through the fractures, Kira could see flashes of other places, burning cities, alien landscapes, and always that creeping darkness advancing like a tide of dissolution. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Hours, perhaps less." Thorn's voice was barely audible above the growing rumble. "The convergence point is almost upon us. Soon the barriers will collapse entirely, and our sanctuary will be exposed to the full fury of the Void Plague." The Boar moved closer to Kira, its warm breath brushing against her hand. In its eyes, she saw not wildness, but ancient wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of guardians who had watched over this place since the beginning. It was offering her a choice that would change not just her own fate, but the destiny of everyone she had ever loved. The chamber groaned around them as reality itself began to buckle and strain. The ancient chamber stretched before them like a cathedral built for giants. Crystalline formations jutted from the walls, each one pulsing with the same ethereal light that had guided them through the tunnels. Maya's breath caught as she took in the impossible architecture, curved walls that seemed to flow like frozen water, arches that defied the laws of physics she'd learned in her limited schooling. "This isn't natural," Kai whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "Someone built this." Elder Thorn moved ahead of them, his lantern now unnecessary in the ambient glow. His shoulders carried a weight that hadn't been there before, and Maya noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he approached the chamber's center. "Not someone," he said quietly. "Something far older than human hands." The floor beneath their feet was smooth as glass, inlaid with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. Maya found herself dizzy trying to focus on them, as if her mind couldn't quite process what her eyes were seeing. The patterns reminded her of the markings they'd found on the Boar, but infinitely more complex, a language written in mathematics and starlight. At the chamber's heart stood a structure that defied description. It rose 30 feet into the air, neither quite pillar nor quite tree, its surface a fusion of organic curves and geometric precision. Veins of light ran through it like luminous sap, and at its base, a pool of perfectly still water reflected depths that seemed impossibly deep. "The heart," Elder Thorn said, and his voice carried reverence and terror in equal measure. "The anchor point between worlds." Maya approached slowly, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't name. As she drew closer, the water's surface began to shimmer, and images flickered just beneath, glimpses of other places, other times. She saw vast cities of glass and light, creatures that moved through the air like living clouds, landscapes where purple mountains touched amber skies. "These are the other worlds," she breathed, "the ones that exist alongside ours." "Dimensions folded together like pages in a book," Elder Thorn confirmed. "Our island sits at the convergence point, where the barriers are thinnest. For generations, the heart has maintained the balance, keeping the worlds separate but connected." Kai circled the structure, his pragmatic mind struggling to accept what he was seeing. But something's changed. The Boar came through, and there have been other signs. The fish returning to strange waters, the way the tides have shifted. "The balance is failing." The voice came from behind them, and they spun to see Dr. Reeves emerging from a different tunnel, her notebook clutched against her chest. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned with the fervor of someone who had found the answer to a lifelong question. "You knew," Maya accused. "When you came here to study our isolated ecosystem, you already knew what you'd find." Dr. Reeves stepped into the light, and Maya could see that she was trembling. I suspected. There were legends, fragments of ancient texts that spoke of convergence points, places where reality wore thin, but I never imagined. She gestured helplessly at the chamber around them. The sophistication of it, the sheer scale. What happens when the balance fails completely? Kai asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. Elder Thorn moved to the pool's edge, staring into its shifting depths. The barriers collapse, all the worlds bleed together into chaos, creatures and landscapes from a dozen different realities, all existing in the same space. The laws of physics become suggestions. Time flows backward and forward simultaneously. Maya watched the images in the water grow more turbulent, the glimpses of other worlds flickering faster now, overlapping and merging in ways that made her stomach lurch. "How long do we have?" "Look around you," Dr. Reeves said grimly. "The crystalline formations, the way the symbols are moving faster, it's already accelerating. I'd estimate days, maybe hours." The chamber seemed to pulse around them, as if responding to her words. The light grew brighter, more urgent, and somewhere in the distance they could hear a sound like cosmic wind rushing through infinite spaces. "There has to be a way to stop it," Kai said desperately. "Some kind of mechanism, a reset button." "The old texts speak of a choice," Elder Thorn interrupted. "When the balance fails, someone must take the heart's place, become the living anchor between worlds." He turned to face them, and Maya saw centuries of knowledge weighing behind his eyes. "But the cost is everything. Your humanity, your connections to this world, your very sense of self. You become something else, eternal, necessary, and utterly alone." The water in the pool began to churn, and the images beneath its surface grew wilder, more chaotic. Maya could see fragments of their own island now, overlapping with alien landscapes, their familiar beach littered with geometric flowers that sang in colors, their village square where creatures of living light danced through buildings that phased in and out of existence. The convergence was accelerating, and time was running out. The ancient chamber stretched before them like a cathedral of nightmares, its walls carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight. Kira's breath caught as she stepped across the threshold, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders. The air tasted of copper and decay, thick with the residue of forgotten rituals. "This is it," whispered Elder Thorn, his voice barely audible in the vast space. "The heart of our prison." Marcus held his torch higher, illuminating the far wall where a massive crystalline structure pulsed with an otherworldly light. The crystal was easily twice his height, its faceted surface reflecting their small group in fractured, distorted images. Within its depths something moved, a darkness that coiled and twisted like smoke trapped in amber. "What is that thing?" Lila's voice trembled as she pressed closer to her brother. The wild boar snorted and pawed at the stone floor, its bristles standing on end. Since leading them through the hidden passages beneath the village, the creature had grown increasingly agitated. Now it faced the crystal with what could only be described as recognition and fear. Elder Thorn approached the pulsing structure with reverent steps. "The binding stone. Our ancestors thought they were protecting us when they forged this prison. They had no idea what they were truly containing." Kira felt drawn to the crystal despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. As she moved closer, the symbols on the walls began to glow with the same sickly light, and she could hear something, a whisper that seemed to come from inside her own mind. "So young, so full of potential, you could be so much more than human." She jerked backward, colliding with Marcus. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" But his eyes were fixed on the crystal, pupils dilated with an unnatural fascination. The darkness within the stone pressed against its crystalline prison, and hairline cracks began to spread across its surface. With each pulse of light, the fractures grew wider, and the whispers grew stronger. Elder Thorn's face had gone pale. "It's weakening. After all these centuries, the binding is finally failing." He turned to face them, his aged features etched with desperation. The boar didn't just escape from the forest, it was sent as a warning. The entity trapped within this stone has been calling to its kin across the void, and they've been answering. What entity? Kira demanded, fighting against the pull of those hypnotic whispers. The last of the umbral court, Thorn replied, a being of pure shadow and hunger that once ruled entire worlds. Our ancestors were refugees, fleeing from its dominion. When they found this island, they thought they could hide. But the shadow followed them, so they trapped it here, sealing it away with their own life force. The crystal pulsed brighter, and a sound like breaking glass echoed through the chamber. A section of the binding stone crumbled away, revealing a glimpse of the writhing darkness beneath. Freedom, the voice hissed in their minds. At last, sweet freedom. And such delicious vessels to inhabit. Lila screamed as tendrils of shadow began seeping from the cracks, reaching toward them with predatory intent. The boar charged forward, its tusks gleaming as it struck the nearest tendril. The shadow recoiled with a shriek that made their ears ring, but more poured forth to take its place. The forest creatures, Marcus gasped, understanding flooding his features. They've been fighting this thing, haven't they? Keeping it contained? For generations, Thorn confirmed, pulling an ornate dagger from beneath his robes. The blade gleamed with the same crystalline light as the prison, but their strength is failing, just as the binding itself fails. We have perhaps hours before it breaks free completely. Kira felt something shift inside her, a warmth that pushed back against the shadow's whispers. The pendant her grandmother had given her, the one she'd worn since childhood, began to glow with soft silver light. The approaching tendrils recoiled from its radiance. The bloodline, Thorn breathed, staring at her pendant. You carry the bloodline of the original binders. What does that mean? But even as she asked, Kira felt the answer resonating in her bones. The warmth spread through her body, and suddenly she could see the magical bonds that held the crystal together, fraying, ancient, on the verge of complete collapse. It means you can reinforce the binding, Thorn said urgently. But the price will be her life, the shadow finished with malicious glee. Yes, child, pour your essence into the prison. Make yourself part of the cage. Live forever in crystalline torment while your friends age and die beyond these walls. Another section of the crystal shattered, and the chamber filled with the sound of hunting calls echoing across dimensions. The umbral court was coming, drawn by their master's imminent freedom. Kira looked at her companions, at Marcus's determined face, at Lila's terror, at the wild boar standing defiantly against impossible odds. Outside this chamber, an entire village slept peacefully, unaware that their world balanced on a knife's edge. The pendant's light grew brighter as she stepped toward the failing prison, her decision crystallizing like ice in her heart. The crystalline chamber beneath the ancient oak pulsed with an otherworldly light as Maya pressed her palm against the smooth surface of what the island's heart had revealed to be a dimensional anchor. The moment her skin made contact, the world exploded into fragments of memory and possibility. She saw the island as it truly was, not a piece of land surrounded by ocean, but a carefully constructed pocket of reality, suspended between worlds like a soap bubble floating in an infinite void. The forest above wasn't just old, it was a living membrane, its roots extending into dimensions her mind could barely comprehend. "The barrier is failing," whispered a voice that seemed to come from the crystal itself. Maya jerked her hand back, but the connection remained, flooding her consciousness with visions of the island's true history. She watched as her ancestors, not shipwrecked survivors as the stories claimed, but refugees from a cosmic war, had fled here when their home dimension was consumed by entities of pure hunger, the devouring dark, they called it, beings that existed between realities, feeding on the substance of worlds until nothing remained but empty space. The island had been their sanctuary, protected by ancient technology that disguised it as an ordinary piece of earth. For generations, the dimensional anchor had held firm, keeping them hidden while the devouring dark swept through reality after reality, always searching, always consuming. But nothing lasted forever. Thomas burst into the chamber, his face pale with terror. "Maya, the boar! It's not what we thought. It's not from our forest at all." She turned to him, her eyes still glowing with residual energy from the crystal. "I know. It's a scout. They found us." The truth settled between them like a physical weight. The wild boar hadn't emerged from their ancient forest. It had torn through from somewhere else, a living probe sent by entities that existed in the spaces between worlds. Its appearance marked the first breach in their reality's camouflage, a crack that would only widen until their sanctuary was exposed completely. "How long do we have?" Thomas asked, though his expression suggested he already feared the answer. The crystal pulsed again, and Maya felt its knowledge flow through her. Days, maybe less. The anchor is destabilizing. Every breach makes the next one easier. Soon they'll pour through like water through a broken dam. She moved to another section of the chamber wall, where symbols that had seemed like random scratches now revealed themselves as a complex control interface. Her hands moved with inherited memory, fingers tracing patterns her conscious mind had never learned. "There might be a way," she said, her voice barely audible. "The anchor can be reset, but it requires—" She paused, reading deeper into the ancient protocols. "It requires a conscious choice. Someone has to stay connected to the system, become part of it permanently." Thomas stepped closer, understanding flickering in his eyes. A sacrifice. More than that, a transformation. Whoever takes on the role won't be human anymore, not in any way that matters. They'll become part of the island's consciousness, aware but separate from everything they once knew. The chamber shuddered around them, and through the crystal walls they could see the massive roots of the oak tree writhing as if in pain. Somewhere above, reality was tearing open again. "There's something else," Maya continued, her hands still moving across the control surface. "The villagers, all of us, we're not entirely human anymore either. Generations of exposure to the dimensional anchor's energy have changed us. That's why we can see through the camouflage, why we instinctively know when something doesn't belong." She showed him another vision through the crystal, the gradual evolution of their people, DNA slowly rewriting itself under the influence of technologies beyond terrestrial science. They were becoming something new, adapted for existence at the intersection of realities. We're the bridge, Thomas realized, between what we were and what we need to become to survive. The chamber filled with a deep, resonant tone, the island's warning system. More breaches were opening. Through the crystal matrix, they could sense tears in reality spreading across the forest like cracks in ice. The devouring dark was pressing against their world, testing every weakness. Maya's hands found the final control sequence, but she hesitated. Once activated, there would be no return to the simple life they'd known. The island would be secure again, but at a cost that would change everyone who remained. "The others need to know," she said. "They deserve to understand what they're choosing." Thomas nodded, but his eyes were already distant, calculating. Some won't be able to handle the truth. Some will want to try running, even though there's nowhere to go. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. Maya stepped back from the controls, the weight of decision heavy on her shoulders. "But first, we need to buy ourselves time. The anchor is failing, but it's not dead yet. There has to be a way to shore up the barriers temporarily." The crystal pulsed again, offering one final revelation. Deep beneath the island, in chambers even older than this one, lay the original architect's fail-safe protocols. Their real journey was just beginning. The ancient chamber beneath the lighthouse pulsed with an otherworldly energy that made Elena's skin crawl. Crystalline formations jutted from the walls like frozen lightning, each one humming with a frequency that seemed to resonate in her bones. The wild boar stood motionless at the chamber's center, its eyes now glowing with the same ethereal light that emanated from the crystals. "The anchor stone," whispered Thomas, his voice barely audible above the harmonic drone. "My grandfather spoke of it in his final days when the fever took him. I thought it was delirium. Elena stepped closer to the massive crystal formation that dominated the chamber's heart. It towered above them, easily 12 feet tall and pulsing with colors that had no names. Within its translucent depths, she could see shapes moving, shadows that might have been memories or might have been something far more dangerous. The boar didn't come from the forest, she realized, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. It came from here, from whatever this place really is. Marcus emerged from behind one of the smaller crystal clusters, his face pale and drawn. I've been studying the inscriptions on the walls. This isn't just some ancient relic, it's a containment system. And according to what I can translate, he paused, swallowing hard, it's failing. The boar turned its massive head toward them, and when it spoke, its voice carried the weight of centuries. The barriers grow weak. What was separated seeks to reunite. The island remembers what it was before the exile. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's dampness. What exile? What are you talking about? Images began to flicker within the anchor stone, scenes playing out like fragments of a half-remembered dream. She saw the island as it had been long ago, not a simple fishing community, but something magnificent and terrible. Towers of living crystal reached toward storm-darkened skies, and beings that were almost but not quite human walked streets that defied geometry. We were cast out, the boar continued, its voice growing stronger, banished to this pocket of reality for crimes the children of men could not comprehend. The anchor stone was meant to keep us here, to prevent our return to the world we once knew. Thomas stumbled backward, his face a mask of horror and recognition. The stories weren't myths. The old families, the original settlers, we're not refugees from some distant land. We're prisoners, all of us. The truth hit Elena like a physical blow. Every strange occurrence on the island, every impossible thing she'd witnessed, suddenly made terrible sense. The way shadows sometimes moved independently of their sources. The fish that occasionally bore too many eyes or fins that looked almost like hands. The children who were born knowing languages no one had taught them. But you're breaking free, she said, understanding flooding through her. The containment is failing, and you're remembering what you really are. The boar nodded slowly. The younger generations feel it most strongly. Their blood remembers, even if their minds resist. You, Elena, carry the strongest memory of all. She wanted to deny it, to insist that she was just a normal person caught up in extraordinary circumstances. But even as the thought formed, she could feel something awakening within her, knowledge that belonged to someone else, power that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The anchor stone's pulse quickened, and cracks appeared along its surface. Where the crystal split, reality seemed to waver. Through the gaps, Elena caught glimpses of the world beyond the island, a world that was about to discover it was not alone in the universe. How long do we have? Marcus asked, his scholarly instincts overriding his fear. Days, perhaps hours, the boar replied. The stone has held for 3 centuries, but it was never meant to be permanent. Eventually, everything returns to its true nature. Elena pressed her hands against the nearest crystal formation, feeling the power thrumming through it. There has to be a way to control it, to manage the transition instead of letting it happen chaotically. The old texts speak of a keeper, Thomas said suddenly, someone who could guide the stone's power, direct its energy. But the knowledge was lost generations ago. The boar's eyes fixed on Elena with uncomfortable intensity, not lost, hidden, waiting for one with the strength to bear the responsibility. She felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Around them, the chamber continued to pulse with increasing urgency, and she knew that whatever choice she made would echo far beyond this hidden place beneath the lighthouse. The island's true nature was awakening, and with it, powers that humanity had forgotten existed. Soon, the barriers between worlds would fall completely, and everyone, villagers and outsiders alike, would face a reality transformed beyond recognition. Elena closed her eyes and reached deeper into the crystal's energy, preparing to embrace a heritage she was only beginning to understand. The ancient chamber beneath the temple pulsed with an otherworldly light as Maya pressed her palm against the crystalline heart embedded in the wall. The moment her skin made contact, the world exploded into fragments of memory and truth that weren't her own. She saw the island as it truly was, not a sanctuary but a prison. Villagers weren't refugees from some distant catastrophe. They were the descendants of those who had fled here centuries ago, carrying with them a terrible burden. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow. They were the guardians of something that should never be released. "The Devourer," she whispered, the word torn from her lips as visions cascaded through her mind. She saw it clearly now, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that existed between dimensions, feeding on reality itself. Her ancestors had lured it here, trapped it beneath layers of protective enchantments, sacrificing their freedom to keep the rest of the world safe. Kyle's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Maya, what's happening to you?" But she couldn't respond. The crystal was showing her more, the gradual weakening of the barriers, the way the island's magic had been slowly failing for generations. The wild boar's emergence hadn't been random. It was a symptom of something far worse. The creature had been touched by the Devourer's influence, transformed into a herald of the chaos that was seeping through the cracks. Elder Thorn's betrayal made sickening sense now. He hadn't been trying to destroy the village out of madness. He'd been trying to strengthen the barriers the only way he knew how. Blood magic. Ancient, terrible rituals that required sacrifice. He'd believed that killing the outsiders would provide enough power to reinforce the prison. But he'd been wrong. The damage was already too extensive. "We're too late," Maya gasped, pulling her hand away from the crystal. The chamber spun around her as she struggled to process what she'd learned. "It's already breaking free." Kyle caught her as she stumbled backward. "What did you see?" "The truth about this place, about why we're really here." She looked up at him, seeing the fear in his eyes that must have been reflected in her own. "My family, all the founding families, we're not survivors, Kyle. We're jailers, and we're failing at the one job that matters most." The ground beneath them shuddered, and somewhere in the distance they heard screaming. Not human screams, something far worse. The sound of reality itself being torn apart. "The village," Kyle said, helping Maya to her feet. "We have to warn them." They raced up the hidden stairs, emerging into chaos. The night sky was wrong. Patches of it seemed to be missing, replaced by a hungry darkness that hurt to look at directly. Buildings flickered in and out of existence, their walls rippling like water, and in the center of the village square, a crack had opened in the very air, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible moving beyond. Villagers ran in all directions, some crying out in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. The Devourer's influence was changing them, just as it had changed the Boar. Maya watched in horror as old Henrik's arm dissolved into shadow before reforming as something with too many joints. "The binding stones," Maya said, remembering fragments of what the crystal had shown her. "There are 7 of them around the island. If we can reactivate them all simultaneously, that would require 7 people with the bloodline," Kyle interrupted. "The founding families. How many are left?" Maya's mind raced through the genealogies she'd memorized as a child. "My family, the Ashfords, the Blackwoods, maybe 5 lines total. And some of them are children, or—" She gestured helplessly at Henrik, who was now more shadow than man. "Then we work with what we have," Kyle said firmly. "Where are the stones?" Before Maya could answer, the crack in the air widened with a sound like breaking glass. Something pushed through, not the Devourer itself, but a tendril of its essence. Where it touched the ground, reality began to unravel. Grass became music, became the concept of blue, became nothing at all. "The lighthouse," Maya said suddenly. "The central stone is in the lighthouse. If I can reach it, if I can pour enough of my life force into it, you'll die," Kyle said bluntly. "Maybe, but if I don't try, everyone dies. Everything dies." She looked at him, memorizing his face, in case these were their last moments together. "The other stones are at the compass points around the island. You need to find the survivors from the founding families and get them to the stones. Tell them what I told you." Another section of sky disappeared, and the screaming grew louder. In the distance, Maya could see the forest itself beginning to dissolve as the Devourer's influence spread. "There has to be another way," Kyle said desperately. Maya kissed him once, quickly, tasting salt and fear. "There isn't. But maybe that's okay. Maybe some cages are worth preserving." Then she was running toward the lighthouse, leaving Kyle to gather what remained of their world's guardians. The ancient chamber beneath the island trembled as the final seal began to crack. Elena pressed her palms against the crystalline surface, feeling the raw power pulsing beneath, power that had kept their world stable for millennia, and power that was now failing. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the growing rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The elder's translucent form flickered as she consulted the shifting runes that danced across the chamber walls. "Hours, perhaps less. The dimensional barriers are collapsing faster than we anticipated. When they fall completely..." She didn't need to finish. They all understood. Their island home wasn't just going to be destroyed, it was going to be absorbed back into the realm from which it had been torn, taking everyone on it into a dimension where human life couldn't survive. Elena closed her eyes, reaching deeper into the crystal's memory. Images flooded her mind. The original cataclysm that had ripped their piece of reality free, the desperate magic that had stabilized it, the careful balance maintained for generations, and something else, a presence that had been watching, waiting. "The Boar," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. It wasn't just a messenger, it was a key. "What do you mean?" Dr. Chen stepped closer, his scientific mind struggling to process the mystical revelations of the past days. The wild boar that started all this. It came from the other side when the barriers weakened. But it wasn't random. Elena's eyes snapped open, glowing with the same ethereal light as the crystal. Something sent it, something that's been trying to reclaim this realm. The chamber shuddered violently, and new cracks spider-webbed across the ceiling. Dust and fragments of stone rained down as the magical supports groaned under impossible strain. "The Devourer," the elder whispered, her form growing more substantial as fear gave her definition. "We thought it had forgotten us, lost us in the chaos between worlds, but it's been searching. Searching for what?" Marcus helped steady Elena as another tremor nearly knocked her from her feet. "For its missing piece." Elena's hand was still pressed against the crystal, and through it she could sense the approaching presence, vast, hungry, and utterly alien. "Our island isn't just a refuge, we're a fragment of something larger, something that was torn away during the original breaking." The implications hit them all at once, their home, their families, their entire reality. Everything was just a wound in something else's flesh, and now that wound was about to be healed. "There has to be another way," Dr. Chen said desperately. "Some alternative to just surrendering everything." Elena felt the answer forming in her mind, terrible and clear. "There is, but the cost?" "Tell us," Marcus said. "The separation can be made permanent. The barriers can be rebuilt stronger than before. But it requires a conscious choice from someone who understands both realities, someone who can bridge the gap between worlds." "You," the elder said simply. Elena nodded, her heart breaking as she looked at Marcus's face. "I have to become the seal, permanently. My consciousness would merge with the barrier itself, holding it stable from within." "No." Marcus grabbed her shoulders. "There has to be another option. You can't... I can't let everyone die because I'm afraid." Elena's voice was steady, but tears streamed down her face. "Every person on this island, every child, every life, they're depending on this choice." Another massive tremor shook the chamber, and this time the crystal cracked. Brilliant light poured through the fissure, and with it came a sound like the screaming of wind across dimensions. "It's starting," the elder warned. "The final collapse. You must choose now." Elena looked around the chamber, at Dr. Chen with his desperate rationality, at the elder with her ancient wisdom, at Marcus with his love and fear written clearly across his face. Then she thought of Sarah and the other children above, of the fishermen and farmers and all the ordinary people who had no idea their world was ending. "I love you," she told Marcus, kissing him one last time. "Remember that, no matter what happens." Before he could stop her, she plunged both hands into the cracked crystal. Power exploded through her, rewriting her very existence. Her consciousness expanded, touching every corner of the island, feeling every life, every heartbeat, every dream. She could sense the Devourer's approach, its hunger for completeness, its need to reclaim what had been taken. But she could also feel the strength of the bonds that held their world together, bonds of love, community, belonging. These people had built something worth preserving in their small corner of reality. Elena made her choice and became the wall between worlds. The chamber blazed with impossible light as the new seal took hold, and reality itself held its breath. The ancient chamber beneath the village temple hummed with otherworldly energy as Maya pressed her palm against the crystalline surface of the core. Through the translucent stone, she could see the island's true heart, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that pulsed with each breath of the sleeping entity they had unknowingly served for generations. "The Keeper spoke the truth," Elder Sato whispered, his weathered face pale in the ethereal glow. "We are not guardians. We are prisoners." The boar stood beside them, no longer the fearsome beast that had crashed through their peaceful existence days ago. Its ancient eyes held wisdom that predated their civilization, and when it spoke through the psychic link Maya had discovered she possessed, its voice carried the weight of centuries. "The barrier weakens with each passing hour. Soon, the sleeper will wake, and when it does, your island will become the bridge between worlds. The darkness that your ancestors fled will pour through, and this reality will be consumed." Kyle stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to the strange mark that had appeared on his forearm, a spiraling symbol that matched those carved into the chamber walls. "There has to be a way to stop it. Our ancestors built this prison for a reason." "They built it in desperation," the boar replied. "But desperation breeds imperfect solutions. The entity feeds on the life force of those within the barrier. Every generation born here strengthens it, prepares it for the moment it can break free." Maya felt a chill run through her as she realized the horrible elegance of their trap. The island's isolation, the villagers' contentment, their reluctance to ever leave, it had all been orchestrated. They were livestock, carefully tended and bred to feed something that existed between dimensions. "The children," she breathed, thinking of the nursery where the youngest villagers played, blissfully unaware of the cosmic horror stirring beneath their feet. "It's been feeding on them most of all, hasn't it? Their innocence, their life force, their potential," the boar confirmed grimly. "Each child born here carries a fragment of the entity's essence. When they reach maturity, that essence returns to strengthen the whole." Elder Sato sank to his knees, the revelation crushing him. "Generations of my family, we thought we were blessed. The island's protection, our longevity, the way our crops never failed." He looked up at Maya with desperate eyes. "Tell me there's still hope." Maya studied the core more carefully, noting how the light patterns within shifted and flowed. The psychic abilities she had developed since the barrier began to weaken allowed her to sense the entity's dreams, vast, alien thoughts that spoke of worlds consumed and realities reshaped. But there was something else, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious evil. "It's not complete yet," she said slowly. "The entity, part of it is still missing." Kyle's mark flared suddenly, and he gasped as images flooded his mind. The boar is the missing piece. He turned to their unlikely ally with new understanding. "You're part of it, aren't you? The part that retained some measure of consciousness, some ability to choose. I am what your ancestors called the witness, the fragment they managed to separate before the binding was complete. I have wandered the spaces between worlds, seeking a way to undo what was done. but I cannot act alone." Maya felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. "That's why you came back now. The barrier's weakening means the entity is trying to reclaim you, but it also creates an opportunity, a narrow one. If the separated fragment, if I, can be destroyed while the entity attempts integration, the shock will weaken it enough for the barriers to be reinforced. But only from the inside." The terrible implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Someone would have to enter the core itself, to stand in the presence of the sleeping entity and strike at the exact moment of vulnerability. The psychic backlash alone would be fatal. "I'll do it," Maya said without hesitation. "I can sense its patterns, feel when the moment is right." "Go." Kyle stepped beside her, his mark now burning with steady light. "We'll do it together. These marks, they're not random. We're connected to this thing in ways we don't fully understand. But connection works both ways." Elder Sato struggled to his feet, aged beyond his years but determined. "And I'll help evacuate the village. If this fails, at least the children might have a chance to escape." The boar regarded them with something that might have been admiration. "You understand what you're proposing? Even if you succeed, the island may not survive. The entity's death throes could shatter the barriers entirely, leave you defenseless against the void between worlds." Maya looked at Kael, seeing her own resolve reflected in his eyes. They had discovered the truth about their prison, about the cosmic horror that had shaped their entire existence. Now they had to choose between comfortable captivity and the terrible freedom of fighting for their world's survival. "Then we'd better make sure we do this right the first time," she said. The morning light filtering through the dissipating mist revealed a world transformed. Where once the ancient forest had stood as an impenetrable wall of shadow and whispered threats, now individual trees were visible, their bark gleaming silver-white in the dawn. The barrier that had imprisoned the villagers for generations was lifting like a curtain being slowly drawn back. Elena stood at the forest's edge, her hand resting on the gnarled trunk of an oak that no longer hummed with malevolent energy. The wild boar, their unlikely herald of truth, grazed peacefully nearby, its tusks no longer seeming like weapons, but simply part of its natural form. Everything had changed since they'd learned what they truly were. "The boats are ready," Marcus called from behind her. His voice carried a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that Elena felt echoing in her own chest. After 17 years of believing the sea was an endless void, the prospect of sailing beyond their shores seemed both miraculous and terrifying. She turned to see the villagers gathered along the beach, their faces reflecting the same complex emotions. Children clung to their parents' hands, eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the fishing boats that would now serve as vessels of exploration. The elderly looked thoughtful, some perhaps remembering fragments of dreams that had seemed like fantasies until now. "Are you ready?" Thorn approached, his weathered features softer than she'd ever seen them. The revelation of their true nature, that they were not merely villagers but refugees from a dying world, placed in this sanctuary until it was safe to emerge, had affected him deeply. As their appointed guardian, he'd carried the burden of maintaining the illusion while waiting for the signs that their exile was ending. Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure ready was the right word. How could anyone be ready to discover that their entire reality had been a carefully constructed haven, designed to protect them while their original home healed from catastrophic magical warfare? The island had been real enough, but it existed in a pocket dimension, sustained by ancient protective spells that were finally, safely dissolving. The boar snorted softly and began walking toward the beach. Elena smiled, remembering their initial terror at the creature's appearance. They'd thought it was a monster, an invasion of their peaceful world. Instead, it had been a messenger, the first sign that the barriers were weakening and their time of sanctuary was coming to an end. "My grandmother always said she dreamed of cities with silver towers," whispered Anna, joining them with her small daughter in tow. "I thought they were just stories." "They weren't stories," Thorn said gently. "They were memories, bleeding through the protective spells. Our real world, it's been healing while we've been safe here." Elena watched as the villagers began loading supplies into the boats with practiced efficiency. Even this felt familiar somehow, as if they'd done it before in another life. Perhaps they had. The magic that had created their sanctuary hadn't erased their past entirely. It had simply buried it deep enough to let them live in peace while their homeland recovered. A child's delighted gasp drew her attention to the horizon. Where yesterday there had been nothing but endless grey sea, shapes were emerging from the thinning mist. Distant mountains painted in shades of purple and gold, and yes, she could just make out the glimmer of silver spires catching the morning sun. "It's beautiful," someone breathed, and Elena realized the voice was her own. The boar waded into the shallow water, looking back at them expectantly. It had done its job as herald and guide. Now it was time for them to follow. One by one, the villagers climbed into their boats, their movements careful but determined. Elena found herself in the lead vessel with Marcus, Thorn, and a handful of others. As they pushed off from the shore that had been their entire world, she felt a complex tangle of gratitude and anticipation. The island had protected them, nurtured them, kept them safe, while terrible magical storms raged across their true home. But it had always been temporary, a chrysalis waiting for the right moment to open. The water beneath their hull was crystal clear, and as they rowed further from shore, Elena could see new paths opening in the depths, currents of light that would guide them home. The boar swam alongside them, powerful and graceful, no longer an alien presence but a familiar companion. Behind them, the island began to fade, not disappearing but becoming translucent, like a memory settling into its proper place. Ahead, a true world grew clearer with each stroke of the oars. The silver towers Anna's grandmother had dreamed of rose into view, and beyond them, Elena could see green forests and rolling hills that felt achingly familiar. They were going home at last, carrying with them the peace they'd learned in sanctuary and the strength they'd discovered in facing the truth. The wild boar had brought them the gift of revelation, and now they would bring their gifts to a world ready to receive them once again.